A note from the author. Here's more from my deadly humans universe. I'm going to be honest, this one kind of got away from me, but although it's long and a bit unfocused at the beginning, I promise it does eventually go somewhere. Since humans became known to the scientific community across the galaxy, it has commonly been said that the natural predators of humans are other humans. This is not entirely inaccurate. They do kill each other with a frankly quite alarming frequency. However, this is not the whole story. The human homeworld, which they rather unimaginatively call Earth, has a rich biosphere, with a number of ecosystems that contain predators capable of killing a human. The diversity and lethality of Earth's apex predators is unusual by galactic standards, although not unheard of. The Geohawk, the largest predator our ancestral Amia ever faced, tops out at about 50 kilos and is thus considerably lighter than most apex predators in Earth's ecosystems. But on the other hand, the Mazu snakes of the Kalu-Kamsku homeworld can reach up to 15 meters in length and nearly 2,000 kilos, making them considerably larger than any land predator on Earth, although not necessarily more dangerous, since gravity on the Kalu-Kamsku homeworld is just slightly more than half what it is on Earth, meaning that Mazu snakes are proportionally much weaker for their size. In regions where Earth's natural ecosystems are still intact, the environment would most likely be considered around grade 10 or 11 by the Amia Science Consortium. Hazardous, verging on highly hazardous, and only one grade down from the most severe classification, grade 12, extremely hazardous. In other words, humans evolved on a planet that most other sentient species would only explore via remote drone. However, like most spacefaring species, humans have long since tamed their planet and carved out large swaths where the natural ecosystems have been replaced by artificial environments. In this, humans are, for once, not unusual at all. Indeed, it is an almost universal part of an intelligent species' development that as their resource acquisition becomes more and more complex, they start to alter their environment to the point where natural ecosystems break down. Either they remove their natural predators deliberately, or predator species decline as a result of habitat loss. For example, the use of nets disrupted the hunting grounds of the Geohawk so thoroughly that in many regions of homeworld they went extinct in prehistory. The Kalu-Kamsku almost wiped out Mazu snakes entirely after they learned to pile tree bark at the entrance of their burrows and set it on fire to suck the oxygen out. Despite their otherwise highly unusual evolutionary history, humans followed this pattern very closely for many of their natural predators. However, as so often is the case with humans, there is an important and highly unusual caveat. I encountered this personally on my trip to the Wolf 359 system. Over the past few decades, it has become more and more common to see humans in the wider galaxy beyond the small region of space they've settled. And while it is less common to see non-human travelers going the other way, a niche area of xenology dealing with humans is rapidly growing. I personally did my doctorate in the xenopsychology of talk materialism, but I had a chance meeting with a xenobiologist who'd worked with humans while studying Zeramnia, the famous death world out past the Cyanian Nebula, and he was able to put me in touch with an exchange program run by the Science Consortium that had started sending small groups of Amia scientists to human worlds in return for introducing human scientists to interspecies research institutes. I later learned this particular xenobiologist championed the exchange program mainly because he didn't want to be the one who got sent on joint research expeditions anymore. His loss, in my opinion, although then again I never had to go to Zeramnia. I signed up on the basis that the field of talk research was already thousands of years old, and there was only so much blood you could squeeze from that particular stone. The human exchange program had already run several successful tours of human-inhabited worlds, and none of them had resulted in the deaths of any of the researchers. I might have been a little more wary otherwise. Humans were still quite an unknown quantity, and what I did know about them was, in a word, disturbing. However, the program was getting more and more applicants every year, and interest in their publications was growing. Never be early to a party and never be late. That's my motto. As with so many things, the key to a successful academic career is timing. I had been hoping that I'd be sent to Earth itself, but competition for places was fierce, and preferential treatment was given to researchers who'd signed up in the program's early phases. Like I said, timing is everything. I was a little disappointed, but on the other hand, I would never have wanted to be the first one to test just how carnivorous humans really are. The colonies were a less popular destination, but by picking Wolf 359, I could be one of the first AMIA to go there. A good place to stake out unclaimed academic territory. I already had something in mind before I left, a comparison of cultural and psychological norms in human colonies versus humans in their natural habitat, or something along those lines. Pretty dry stuff, really, but it's the kind of thing you can build a solid career on. The colonies in the Wolf 359 system were fairly developed, but still nowhere near as overcrowded as Earth, which currently has a population of over 10 billion, a little cramped for a planet that's 70% ocean. Around 200 million colonists were distributed between the single rocky planet in the system, known simply as Wolf, and the moons of the gas giant and the various asteroids. The star itself is a red dwarf, just under 8 light-years from Earth, small and faint by the standards of most inhabited systems. The planet Wolf had been terraformed to something approaching the climate of Earth's subarctic latitudes, not exactly pleasant for AMIA, given that we evolved in tropical jungles, but that was another reason I didn't have much competition from my colleagues. It wouldn't be fun, but I could always wear a coat, and I was genuinely interested to see how humans had adapted to living in such a harsh environment. The answer turned out to be simpler than I thought: cows, and sheep, goats, horses, and some bison. But mostly cows. It's common knowledge that humans are carnivores and, as far as anyone knows, the only predatory species that has ever evolved sentience. The most normal reaction to this is to recoil in horror and not think too much more about it. If you spend any time at all thinking about how humans eat, you no doubt imagine them chasing down some unfortunate herbivore and bashing it to death with a blunt instrument. Presumably, this was how they started out. But just as with every other species in the galaxy, their development went hand in hand with exerting greater control over their food sources. In every sentient species, there comes a point when simply harvesting whatever is growing naturally isn't enough to sustain population growth. The population goes through cycles of growth and famine until finally the species learns how to artificially increase the productivity of their food source, and the cycle is interrupted. In the AMIA, and every other sentient species apart from humans, this started with horticulture, which developed into agriculture. We started taking seeds from our favorite fruit trees and spreading them deliberately and strategically in order to maximize the amount of fruit in a given area. Then, over the millennia, we discovered that if we spread only the seeds of the most productive trees, we could increase not just the number of trees, but their output. And once we worked that out, thousands rather than hundreds of individuals were able to roost together, enabling specialization. In short, discovering selective breeding is a necessary prerequisite for civilization. In this regard, humans were no different than any other species. But being carnivores, they didn't start with plants. I arrived on Wolf on a science consortium transport with 5 other researchers. 3 of them were geologists, so their activities were of no interest to me whatsoever or any other sane person. One was an astronomer making a study of red dwarfs, who wasn't interested in the humans at all and just found it a convenient place to study the star. The last was a political scientist who was writing a paper on human political divisions. I might be able to at least hold a conversation with him, but otherwise I could expect to have little company during my time there. And little competition. I was met by my human liaison, Professor Orson Fitzgerald. I didn't have many points for comparison at first, but now, after spending some time around humans, I can say he's fairly heavily built, even for a human male. Approaching late middle age with an expansive demeanor that could come off as aggressive if you didn't know the excessive volume was simply a sign of enthusiasm. He is bald, which will never not be unsettling for an AMIA, although when I first met him he did at least maintain some plumage, a large mustache, black speckled with gray. He was also sharp as hawk talons. I had come prepared with a list of topics to start my research in, but he met me at the arrivals gate with a welcome package that included summaries of half of what I'd planned to study, as well as a lot of material on the history of the Wolf League and the settlement of Wolf and the system's other colonies. And then on the ride to the alien-adapted hotel, he gave me a short overview of the overview. Just a bit of background on the system. It had been discovered by and named after an astronomer on Earth several hundred years earlier, Max Wolf, and then settled in the first phase of human interstellar expansion. The weak, red-tinted sun had made the planet unsuitable for a lot of ecosystems. But after the atmosphere had been established, the early terraformers had just about been able to get various species of grass to take root. From this, they had built an ecosystem that mostly revolved around grazers, although in the last few decades there had been some progress in developing forests in those areas that weren't now being used for agriculture. My first question was both incredibly inane and, it turned out later, incredibly pertinent. Excuse me, but why is there a very dangerous-looking animal at the beginning of all these documents? Some sort of native wildlife. I pointed at the furred face with large fangs staring out of my data tablet. No, Orson answered, chuckling. There was nothing here before the terraforming. That's Wolfie, well, I suppose you'd call her the emblem of the Wolf League. You'll see her a lot during your time here. On the flag, on the government buildings, on license plates, well, we put her on just about everything. My follow-up question was, what's a wolf? I had, of course, read through the history of the place I was visiting, and Max Wolf's name had come up briefly, but I hadn't realized the name was connected to an animal. Orson explained that they were an apex predator that once ranged over much of Earth's northern latitudes, although they'd been driven to extinction in many areas as they competed with humans for prey. Pack hunters that usually live in groups of 2 to 10 animals. They're capable of bringing down prey several times their size. They were also fully capable of killing a lone human, which sent a shiver down my spine. There are a lot of dangerous creatures in the galaxy, but there are very few species that could pose a serious threat to an adult human. That said, even in prehistory, humans had rarely been predated on by wolves. With the advantage of numbers and intelligence, humans were usually more of a threat to wolves than the other way around. However, wolves were still considered enough of a danger that many regions of Earth had organized deliberate extermination campaigns to destroy wolf populations. Despite this, humans respected wolves for their hunting prowess. Wolves appeared a lot in ancient human art, and this motif with its associations with aggression and fearlessness had carried down into the present day. Being indirectly named after the species, the Wolf League had adopted the creature who'd once terrorized their ancestors as their emblem. This was quite literally an alien concept to me. We may not fear Geohawks in quite the same way ancient Amia did, but we don't go around putting them on flags either. Still, this was exactly the sort of thing I'd come to learn about. "Are there any living wolves on Wolf?" I asked, somewhat afraid to hear the answer. Orson smiled. "We keep a couple of breeding pairs, enough to sustain a small population. Importing them from Earth was tricky, but being our totem animal, we thought we had to give it a go. They're not easy to raise here, though. The only specimens we have are kept in zoos, and they have to be pretty closely looked after. I'll take you to see the ones we have here in the city sometime, if you want." I politely said I'd think about it. At that point, I had other things in mind, and none of them involved putting myself face to face with a deadly predator, even if it was behind reinforced glass. The capital city of the planet was called Lupercal, another reference to wolves. It was moderately large and built up, a population of 5 million in an area of around 20,000 square kilometers. I didn't see much of it during the journey to the hotel and made a mental note to ask about air traffic control so I could have a look at the place from an aerial perspective. I was constantly conscious of the fact that I was now among a species that was flightless, and thus had to be aware that their living spaces would not be constructed with avian mobility in mind. As it happened, I did plenty of flying in the next couple of days, although not on my own wings and not over the city. The first thing Orson had arranged was for us to take a light aircraft and go have a look at the ranches nearest Lupercal. Although there had been recent efforts to introduce more biodiversity in the way of trees and shrubs, the city was still mostly surrounded by grasslands, which were managed in much the same way as they had been since the planet was first settled, as pasture for herds of some of the humans' favorite prey animals. As Orson explained it, the story of Wolf was really the story of ranchers. That was what had made it economical to settle the planet, at a time when many of Earth's mismanaged grassland ecologies were collapsing under the pressures of intensive cattle farming, which was an odd term to my ears because farming as I understood the term was something you did to plants. But apparently, humans had a long history of farming animals, to the point that the prey species that made up the vast majority of the meat in their diet were so heavily domesticated they were essentially completely docile. Unlike plants, which needed constant attention and complex machinery to process, cows would roam the plains feeding themselves, then would compliantly let the ranchers herd them back to the farmhouse for the, harvest. The first visit was to one of the oldest ranches on Wolf Yosemite, established by one of the original terraformers as a way of adding fresh produce to an otherwise monotonous diet of rations shipped in from Earth. The first stock had been imported as frozen embryos and grown in an incubator. But then they'd been left to graze the plains of this distant world in just the same way their ancestors on Earth had done for millions of years. They'd thrived here, and the human colonists had thrived with them. Orson himself was a descendant of that pioneer and some kind of distant relation of the ranch's owner, Burton Carradine. The cowshed was an experience I'll not forget for the rest of my life, no matter how long I live. The smell was obscene, and the noise was, well, it wasn't too different from a faculty meeting, actually, but the thing that shocked me most was that I had never, ever been so close to so many large animals. Each one must have weighed more than 500 kilos, heavier than anything you would find on Homeworld except in the deep seas. Despite being outweighed 5-1, the humans had no fear of approaching them, and indeed the cows would quite happily let them get near and even touch them without reacting. It was fascinating. Domesticating animals isn't entirely unknown across the galaxy. The Tok'tok, for example, keep colonies of small predators called mech, which hunt the insects that eat the tubers and roots that make up the majority of their diet. Their relationship has developed to the point where they can instruct the mech to target particular harmful species and leave other beneficial species alone. But although biological control of pests isn't uncommon, domestication is. And before the discovery of humans, the mech were a rare example of a species that had been habituated to living as part of a sentient society without being sentient themselves. The explanation for why humans displayed this unusual trait was obvious. Most species have much less incentive to develop the skills needed to domesticate animals, since most species don't use them as a food source. The question was, how did it affect their society? I learned a considerable amount about cows from Burton Carradine, who'd been farming them all his life. Not only are they used for their meat, they secrete a substance called milk to feed their young, which can be eaten by humans as well. Or rather, some humans. So far back did the relationship between the two species go, lactose tolerance had only evolved in adult humans after the domestication of the cow. Most of the stock at Yosemite Ranch was raised for its meat, but they kept some dairy cows for tradition's sake and to supply their own family with fresh milk. He even showed me how to squeeze the white liquid out of a fleshy protuberance on the cow's underside. The cow just stood there placidly, even though it could have crushed him any time it pleased. Before we left, Burton Carradine introduced to me to his 4 sons, who were adults, and their juvenile offspring. There were 5 children who ranged in age from a few months to 12 years, and the oldest 2, Bethany and Layla, had pet goats, which they knew how to take care of and extract milk from. I had never encountered a juvenile human before, and interestingly, when I asked if they ate the goats, they seemed very much against the idea. You would think even young humans would have an inbuilt predatory instinct, but apparently, although they were happy to eat beef from the ranch, I asked, and they proudly proclaimed their love for Grandpa's burgers, eating the goats they tended was too much for them. Visiting the ranch was an amazing experience, although I was not without my qualms. In the back of my mind, I was aware that while the goats may have got lucky, the eventual fate for most of these animals was to be slaughtered and consumed by their human caretakers. Now, we Amiya generally aren't too sentimental about non-sentient animals. We may not hunt and kill them for food, but our agricultural practices involve the deaths of a lot of pests that consume our crops. And before more ecologically sound farming was developed, we drove many species to extinction through habitat destruction. However, it's one thing to impersonally poison or trap a gria rat that was going to eat your fruit. It's another thing to raise an animal for years, care for it, gain its trust, then kill it and eat its flesh. Or at least, so I felt at the time. However, after I got back to the hotel, I reassessed my feelings and asked myself whether I was being too Amy-centric in my perspective. Those cows wouldn't be there in the first place if the humans hadn't raised them, no different from any fruit tree. If I could justify the death of a gria rat, was it really that different to kill an animal you had a prior relationship with? Especially if that relationship had always been based on a carnivore's quid pro quo. We protect you now, we eat you later. I doubt most Amiya would ever be able to get over the idea of killing and consuming the flesh of another living being, but I was a scientist, and you don't get into xenopsychology to be narrow-minded. And my mind was certainly opening up to a lot of new possibilities. I'd come to Wolf with some ideas about assessing human adaptations to their extraterrestrial environment, but that had all been overtaken by the potential in exploring the human relationship with the animals they lived alongside. Of course, the first thing I did was boot up my database of academic publications on humans and check no one else had beat me to it. Fascinating or not, there was no point in spending time writing a paper on it if someone had already beaten me to the punch. There were lists of animals humans were known to farm, which included a disturbing number of avian species, but I tried to put that out of my mind. However, there was nothing on them beyond some rather dry statistics: size, weight, number of individuals, calories provided, etc. No one had thought to look too closely at how humans interacted with their food. Partly, this was because cattle farming had fallen out of favor on Earth because of the amount of land it required, and a lot of other meat production had been mechanized to the point where humans had very little contact with the animals. However, there was still a considerable amount of more traditional farming done on Earth. It appeared Amiya researchers had simply been too squeamish to investigate it closely. Jackpot. New discoveries hide where scientists fear to look, as the saying goes, and new discoveries are what successful academic careers are built on. Over the next few days, Orson showed me several more ranches within 200 kilometers or so of Lupercal, as well as several other types of livestock farm. The first colonists had wanted to diversify their food supply as much as possible in case the terraforming broke down or some species couldn't hack it in the new environment. Sheep, a much smaller ruminant grazer, were among the most popular livestock after cows, and there were several species which had been bred specifically for their coat, which could be shorn and made into clothing. Another novelty: not every sentient species bothered with clothing, and the ones that did all made their garments out of plant fibers, or glass fibers in the case of the Upau Rokvau, before synthetics were developed. The bison were certainly an impressive sight. There were only a few of them, as overhunting had almost driven them to extinction on Earth, and human interactions focused a lot more on preserving the species than farming them for commercial purposes. They were also much less domesticated, and I was warned to keep my distance. Interesting, then, that the ranchers were still confident enough to work with them rather than the more docile cattle breeds. That humans felt at ease around cows could be explained by thousands of generations of mutual evolution to acclimate them to each other, but the humans were still prepared to boss around an animal that was not just able, but perfectly willing to trample them into paste. This was very much to my benefit, however, as it provided me a way of contrasting how humans dealt with domesticated and undomesticated farmed animals. This was certainly looking like a promising area of research. I was already sketching out titles: Perspectives on Human Civilization as a Collective of Human and Non-Human Species, Co-Adapted to Function as a Single Social Organism. Well, titles were never my strong point. I could work on coming up with something more pithy later. Orson hadn't been expecting me to take to the subject of livestock so readily. He'd arranged for me to take tours of several significant buildings in Lupercal, like the Capitol building, and both the old courthouse used by the first colonists and the new judicial buildings, which were all very interesting, of course, and would no doubt form part of my overview of the colony, but I quickly became sure that I wanted to focus on how humans approached farming and how that had been adapted for the colony on Wolf. As soon as Orson was able to arrange it, we went back to Yosemite Farm. This time, we went out to see the herd as it was grazing, and I was able to take to the air and get a good overview of the way the humans directed their animals. Most of the ranch hands were riding four-wheeled vehicles called quad bikes, but Burton Carradine himself was riding a horse. Like the cows used for milk and the sheep kept for their wool, horses had many uses beyond simply dinner. In fact, horse meat was rarely eaten. Historically, they had been heavily relied on as a means of transport, and the original wild species had been selectively bred until it was large enough to carry an adult male human and a considerable amount of gear. Again, using animals for transport wasn't unheard of across the galaxy. We ourselves used to use kaya pigeons to carry messages, their homing instinct being very reliable. However, that was a trick that was occasionally and sporadically used with wild specimens. We never went to the trouble of breeding an entirely new subspecies just to carry stuff around for us. It would never even have occurred to anyone to try. Carradine's two eldest grandchildren, Bethany and Layla, were also out on horseback with him. I landed near him and asked for an explanation of how he was controlling the horse, and he decided Bethany should give me a demonstration. "You squeeze with your legs to make the horse go," she said. "The harder you press, the faster it goes." And at her command, a good 500 kilos of animal burst into motion. Bethany shouted back, "And you turn by pulling the reins to the side you want to go." The horse wheeled round and came back, jogging along at what looked like a moderately fast pace. "How fast can they run?" I asked. "A thoroughbred racehorse can just about do 50 miles an hour over short distances," Burton Carradine answered. "But our horses aren't bred for speed, so I'd say around 30 miles per hour at a gallop. Bethany, why don't you show him? Be careful, mind." The child got the horse to turn again, and then she dug her heels into its sides and it bolted. The speed itself wasn't that impressive from an Amiya's perspective. I personally could fly at double that speed, and of course in a dive I could triple or even quadruple it. However, the raw power under her control was incredible. With that much muscle and bone at that velocity, anything that didn't get out of the way would just be obliterated. Were horses bred primarily for transport, or were they used for hunting as well? "Oh, horses were used for everything," Carradine told me. "Stock horses for herding, pack horses bred to carry large weights, and draft horses meant to pull carts and machinery. Draft horses were the biggest. We don't have any on Wolf, but they'd be about twice the weight of what you see here. Race horses are the most common type now. They're a sport breed. We keep them just for the fun of seeing how fast a horse can go. Rest of the old breeds are preserved mostly for the sake of tradition, although here on Yosemite our horses can still put in a good day's work. We could do most of the job with quad bikes and drones, but when the ground's uneven or rains have mired things up, I still think it's good to have that backup." Bethany came galloping back, pulling her horse up just in front of us. "Do you want me to show him again?" she asked eagerly. "No, that's all right. I think he got the idea," Carradine said, laughing. "At what age do children normally learn to ride?" I asked. "I wouldn't say there's a normal age these days. Very few people learn to ride at all. It's more popular on Wolf than it is just about anywhere now because we've got the grasslands for it, but even here it's still just ranch workers and a few sporting enthusiasts. These two," he nodded at Bethany and Layla, "started when they were 4, on one of the ponies. They're a bit smaller than these. But there were ancient tribes on Earth who started their children riding before they could even walk. On the Mongolian steppe, which doesn't look too different from this, there were people who lived their entire lives on horseback, herding their livestock, hunting, waging war." "Humans used horses to fight other humans?" I asked incredulously. "Oh, they were the peak of military technology for 3,000 years. The Mongolian tribes were great archers. They'd ride up, shoot their enemy full of arrows, then ride away again before the enemy could respond. I always wanted to try shooting a bow from horseback." Bethany piped up, proving that human children did have at least some predatory instinct. "Like the Amazons, but Daddy won't let me." "Because your daddy has seen you trying to shoot with 2 feet on the ground. Maybe master that before you bring a horse into the equation." Carradine snorted. "Anyway, horse archers were dangerous if they had plenty of open space to maneuver in." But lancers were the real peak of cavalry warfare. Europeans, my ancestors, they didn't have so much grassland, so they mostly bred chargers. A war horse that could carry a man in full armor and ride right through enemy foot soldiers, trample anything that got in their way. Having just seen Bethany galloping towards me, I could all too easily imagine what that would look like. I didn't like to think what it must have been like to see that coming towards you and not have the comfort of knowing you could fly away. You mean you spent thousands of years breeding horses so that they wouldn't attack you, and then you spent thousands more breeding ones that would attack you? I asked. Well, sure, it sounds kind of dumb when you put it like that, Carradine snorted. But then war's kind of a dumb thing to do anyway, although sadly some of us still haven't figured that out. Besides, war horses weren't bred to be vicious. They were just bred to be obedient, enough that they'd charge into a mass of frightened, screaming men, which I'm sure I don't need to say is the opposite of their natural instinct. That's really what all warfare comes down to. Discipline overcoming fear. War horses had it bred into them, but men you have to train. Warfare was such an alien concept to Amia. We used to have intergroup squabbles, of course, but we much preferred to argue without resorting to physical confrontation. If things got heated enough, there might be biting or shoving, but the group with the fewest individuals would always back down rather than risk serious injury or death. Most other intelligent species are naturally averse to violence, especially against their own kind, simply as a matter of self-preservation. I'd always thought that warfare was simply an outgrowth of humans' predatory instinct, but Carradine made it sound like aggression wasn't the primary driver of warfare. Perhaps it was the experience they gained altering other animals served them that allowed some humans to force their own kind to engage in what from our perspective looked like mass suicide. I wasn't sure that hypothesis would hold up. I'd have to check if human societies that made extensive use of domesticated animals were more violent than those that hunted wild. However, I was confident I had more fundamental insights into human culture in the last hour than most Amia researchers managed in years of field studies. We returned to the ranch buildings near sunset, and I watched as Bethany and Layla showed me how they removed the bridle and saddle from their horses and put them in their stalls. Their father was there to supervise them, but the two children were able to handle the large animals without any difficulty. It was at this point Orson rejoined us. He'd declined a trip out onto the plains on the grounds his back was in no condition to handle a quad bike. He started explaining in more detail the history behind horse breeding and how the nomads who originally captured wild horses had taken advantage of their herding instinct to control them. I had thought that a herbivorous species might be relatively easy to tame, but apparently wild horses were proverbially hard to handle and could easily deliver a fatal kick. It really did seem like a lot of Earth's fauna was capable of murdering you if it decided to. And I was just about to make a note of that when I heard a noise. At first I thought it might be humans shouting, but it was too loud and too abrupt. It was also accompanied by a very animalistic snarl. Suddenly, I caught a blur of movement out the corner of my eye. I turned and saw the source of the barking sounds: dark fur, long muzzles, big teeth. I leapt into the air just before they reached me, heart pounding so hard that if I hadn't taken off, I probably would have fainted. I gained some altitude, then became aware that I could hear shouting, human shouting this time, coming from below me. "Hey, hey, it's all right, they're safe! You can come down!" It was Orson, waving his arms, and apparently not in the least bit concerned that he was surrounded by a pack of wolves. I got my breath back, then came to land on top of one of the buildings. Trying not to sound too ruffled, I shouted down, "You said there were no wolves running free on this planet. Oh no, these aren't wolves. I've seen plenty of pictures of wolves since I got here. This planet is obsessed with them. Those things are wolves." Amia had never historically had to face any threats from flightless predators, but seeing a pack of wolves up close, I was very much prepared to develop an instinctive fear of them. They weren't huge, smaller than a geohawk, although from their build they probably weighed about the same, 50 kilos or so. But there were 5 of them, and I was confident those teeth would make short work of me if I ever got within reach. "No, no," Orson called back. "These are dogs." Before he could explain what the hell a dog was, Carradine came thumping round the corner, and by putting 2 fingers in his mouth made a shrill and incredibly loud whistle. The creatures stopped barking at once. "Get over here! Come on, get!" And to my amazement, the 5 animals obediently went over to him. "That's right. Sit, sit. Good boys. Who let you out then?" Carradine then looked up at me. "My apologies. The dogs were meant to be shut up while you were here. I don't know how they got out." "Sorry, PA, that was my fault." One of his sons came over. "I always bring them over to say hi to the girls when they get back from horse riding. I forgot we had visitors." "Well, get your head screwed on properly, Hank," Carradine snapped. "You could have caused a whole diplomatic incident. Take them back to the kennel." "Wait," I called down. "What are those things?" "Dogs. German shepherds, to be specific. They help around the farm, herd the livestock, sniff out lost animals, that sort of thing." "They look a hell of a lot like wolves." "Well, that's because their ancestors were, once upon a time. But that was thousands of years ago. We've been keeping them as pets ever since. They're called man's best friend for a reason." He chuckled and looked down at the nearest dog. "Yes, you are. You're man's best friend, aren't you, boy?" And he reached down and started scratching the creature behind its ear. From the way its tail wagged, I could only assume it enjoyed this. "Hold on!" I shouted down from the rooftops. "You mean you took one of the most dangerous predators on your planet and you domesticated it?" "That's right," Carradine replied. "In fact," Orson added, "dogs are thought to be the first species ever domesticated by humans." I was shocked. I had assumed that humans would mainly have been interested in domesticating prey species. My introduction to dogs hadn't just made my life flash before my eyes. Worse, it was upending everything I'd been planning to put in my thesis. Bethany and Layla had put their horses away and were now rubbing the dogs rhythmically behind their head and along their flanks. The creatures were showing no signs of aggression towards the 2 small children. Is it safe for me to come down and take a closer look?" I asked, not at all sure I wanted to try it. "Well," Carradine equivocated, "they're generally very safe, but they can be aggressive towards people they don't know. We weren't quite sure how they'd react to an alien, so we decided not to risk it and keep them shut up while you were here. But if you want to come say hello, well, it should be safe enough if we take a few precautions. Hank, get the leashes." A few minutes later, the dogs were all tied up and under the control of a human. Or at least, so I hoped. Bethany was holding one of the leashes, and I didn't see how a 40-kilograms child was going to stop a creature that weighed as much as she did or more from going wherever it wanted. On the other hand, I'd just seen her handling an animal 10 times that size without any problems, which at least gave me a little bit of confidence. I dropped off the building and glided lazily down to the ground. The dogs started barking, and I almost took flight again, but their human handlers quieted them down. The one Carradine was holding was still emitted a low growl, so I edged a little closer to Bethany's, which seemed more placid. "Is it safe for me to get close?" I asked. Bethany smiled. "Only one way to find out," she said, which wasn't the answer I was looking for. But she continued. "This is Ragnar. He's 4 years old. Earth years, that is, and I've known him since he was a puppy. It's okay, he won't bite. Come on, Raggy, let's say hello." She took a step forward, and the dog used the extra slack on the leash to move a meter closer to me. It sniffed, then let out a soft but unmistakable growl, and it took all my self-control not to jump back. "Raggy, Raggy, be nice. This is a friend." The dog calmed down a little, and I approached until I was almost within touching distance before it occurred to me what I'd just seen. How intelligent are they? They actually seem to understand at least some of what you say. "They know their names," said Carradine Sr., "and they've got a set of verbal commands they've been trained to respond to." "How large is a dog's vocabulary?" "It varies from breed to breed. German Shepherds are on the higher end of the scale. If I remember correctly, they top out at about 1,000 words. We only teach our dogs about 100, but they pick more up as they go along. They respond to tone of voice and body language as much as spoken words, though." "Fascinating," I said, my desire to learn more still very much struggling against my desire not to get eaten. I edged a little closer to Raggy, and was relieved when the animal didn't immediately lunge at me. "Do you want to touch him?" asked Bethany. "Is that a good idea?" I asked. I mainly wanted to inspect the dog's features close up and judge their behavior. They were indeed extremely wolf-like, but up close I could see subtle differences. The snout and face were a little narrower, and although they clearly had a highly developed musculature, they weren't quite as heavily built as wolves, at least insofar as I had seen from pictures. They also seemed to be obeying the human's commands, although I wasn't sure I wanted to put that to the test by trying to touch one. Up close, I could also see just how big its teeth were. "Sure. Come on, Raggy." She slipped her fingers through the collar, then without warning, she brought the dog forward. Before I knew it, I had a large carnivore right in my face. It let out another soft growl, but Bethany put her hand over its muzzle. "No, no. Be nice, Raggy." And once again, the dog quieted down. "Granddad says you gotta be firm with them. If you show fear, they'll get antsy, but if you act like you're in charge, then they'll just follow along." "Ah, yes," I said. "Their ancestors were pack animals. I imagine their social instinct must be quite strong." I could see the sense in acting like a pack leader, and I was talking because I was still working up the nerve to actually follow through on that. Gingerly, I reached out a hand. "He likes to be rubbed behind the ears," said Bethany. "Okay, well, time to see how deep my commitment to science really is," I thought to myself. And if the dog did go berserk, I was sure the humans would be able to pull it off me in time to save me. Well, reasonably sure. I moved my hand a little closer, and when the dog didn't snap at it, I very lightly touched the top of the dog's head. Good boy, Bethany said, and it took me a second to realize she was talking to the dog, which was waiting very patiently for me to decide whether I was going through with this or not. She turned to me. "Go on, scratch his ears." I started rubbing behind Ragnar's ears as I'd seen Bethany do, and then, very tentatively, I tried to say in English, "Good boy." Ragnar accepted this offering, then lurched forward. I almost jumped away, but Bethany yanked the dog back by the collar. "It's okay, he just wants to sniff you," she said, and indeed Ragnar seemed more interested in seeing what I smelled like than seeing what I tasted like. "He's just curious. He's never smelled an alien before." "Smell is a dog's primary sense," Orson added. "Their eyes are okay and they've got good ears, but their sense of smell is excellent. Far, far better than ours. They can follow scent trails that are days old over hundreds of kilometers if need be." "A useful trait for a predator," I observed. "That's probably a big reason why our distant ancestors domesticated them," Orson said. "Humans are good hunters, but we're nowhere near as good at finding prey as wolves." "Hunting dogs were some of the most popular breeds back on Earth," Carradine added. "Not much call for them on this planet, what with there being nothing to hunt." "You said this breed is used for herding livestock?" I asked. "That's right. They were mostly intended for sheep, but you can use German shepherds to round up cattle if you train them for it. Back on Earth, they also used to have a big role guarding the flock in areas where there were still wild wolves and bears. Very strong instinct for protecting their own pack. That's why you have to be a little careful introducing them to new people, just in case they mistake them for a threat." I had a vague idea of what a bear was from glancing over the list of Earth's native apex predators, and it was even more dangerous than a wolf. I'd heard a lot of incredible things today, but that one topped everything. "You mean you took a predator and you selectively bred it to protect you and fight other, larger predators for you?" "That's right. That was it. That was what I was going to write my paper on. I could include as part of a larger work on how humans had domesticated various animals and then transplanted them to their colonies. But the relationship between humans and dogs was a career-making opportunity. I was fairly confident that no species anywhere in the galaxy had ever taken this approach to dealing with predators. Although not every intelligent species had an ancestral predator they'd had to deal with as they evolved sentience, the vast majority did. And nowhere else in the galaxy had anyone ever taken one of their predator species and domesticated it, much less used it to fight other predators. The Tok-Tok had their symbiotic relationship with the mech, which had similarities, an animal species domesticated to control other animals that competed for food. But the mech fed on small plant eaters, never on the Tok-Tok themselves, and nor were they remotely capable of taking on the Tok-Tok's natural predators. Every other sentient species in the galaxy had dealt with their natural predators by either killing them outright or developing defenses like nets or walls to keep them out of shared habitats. No one, in recorded history, had ever tried to make friends with something that wanted to eat them. I was going to have to learn a lot more about dogs. Tentatively, I reached out to pat Ragnar again. Before I could react, he jumped up on me, knocking me off my feet. Then, as the teeth closed in and my life flashed before my eyes, he started licking me, great slobbery tongue all over my face. "Sorry, no, Raggy, no!" Bethany exclaimed, dragging the dog off me. "I'm really sorry. He only did it because he likes you." "Oh, good," I thought as I lay in the dirt on the verge of a heart attack. At least I was off to a positive start with my new subject. That seemed like a good point to wrap up my visit for the day. The ride back to the city was accompanied by Orson's effusive apologies. I got back to the hotel and washed the mud, or at least what I hoped was mud, out of my feathers. It took very careful preening to get all the dog saliva out as well. Then I got to work. First, I checked the AMIA databases to see what had already been written on the subject. Virtually nothing, as it turned out. Dogs were listed under humans, domesticated species, but the entry was just a basic list of attributes like average height, weight, etc. I think most researchers who'd been to Earth hadn't even noticed dogs, and the ones that had just assumed the humans ate them. Fair enough. That would be the most logical reason a famously carnivorous species would keep a domesticated animal. But no one that thought to look deeper. Their loss, my gain. Next, I checked the human databases to see what they had on dogs. An awful lot, apparently. Far too much for me to go through without some kind of guide. And what should appear in my inbox almost as soon as I thought it? A message from Orson with an overview of both the physiology and psychology of dogs and their history with humans. Orson had been a welcoming and generous host so far, but if there was one thing I liked about him more than anything else, it was that the man knew his job. It was almost a shame he'd been born on this tiny colony. A mind like that would have done well in the AMIA Science Consortium. I felt a little ashamed now that when I first met him, I still was slightly afraid that he'd try to eat me. The next morning, I talked over with Orson the direction I planned to take my research in, focusing on dogs primarily, their place in human society and their transition from wolves to man's best friend, which would be in the wider context of human domestication of animals, which I would in turn present through case studies of the way that had been adapted for life on Wolf Colony. We spent most of the morning going through that, and then in the afternoon we had a trip to the Colonial Museum that had been arranged a few weeks earlier. The artifacts from the original terraformers and the early years of the colony were interesting, but as I was politely nodding along to the tour guide, my mind was racing with much more canine-focused ideas. The next day, however, Orson had a treat for me. We were going to a park. AMIA cities tend to be built around, above, and sometimes inside trees, but humans usually draw a hard distinction between city and not city, and only a few areas of green space were set aside for exercise and recreation. Because it was a public space, he couldn't clear the area in advance of our visit, so I received a lot of somewhat uncomfortable stares. I'd gotten very good at ignoring the fact that I was surrounded by millions of carnivores, but being the center of attention wasn't the most enjoyable experience. I was, of course, aware why they were staring at me, and it had nothing to do with hunger. I'm pretty scrawny anyway. Alien visitors are rare in human space in general, and certainly on a colonial outpost like this, there wouldn't be more than a few dozen on the entire planet at any one time. I was in all likelihood the first alien these people had ever seen in person. I wasn't sure what we were doing there at first, but then I noticed that many of the humans around the park had dogs with them. Not only that, but Orson had arranged for us to meet a friend of his from the university, Sabine, and she brought her own dog with her. The breed was what's known as a terrier, which is considerably smaller than a German shepherd, although also considerably more excitable from what I could see. The first thing Sabine showed me was how to instruct her dog, which, confusingly, she'd called Mouse, with various commands like sit, stay, roll over, and beg. I had mixed success. Mouse apparently had a hard time believing in my authority to give him orders, which was fair enough, as even though he was only a few kilos, I was still terrified he'd leap at me. Still, I did manage to get him to roll over and play dead. I felt I should be taking notes from him just in case I got on the wrong end of one of the other dogs in the park. Even with everything I'd learned over the last few days, it was still hard to believe everyone was comfortable having these aggressive predators just running around everywhere. Then we tried playing fetch. It did not go well at first, although at least there I could blame Amia physiology. Among their other idiosyncrasies, humans throw much better than other species. After the fifth time Mouse brought back the ball from just a few meters away, I couldn't take the look of mild disappointment on his face anymore. However, a good scientist can always adapt to overcome a problem. I discovered that if I took off and built up some speed, I could drop the ball and launch it quite far, although Mouse then had to wait for me to land again to bring it to me, which resulted in him spinning in circles trying to follow me until he got so dizzy he fell over. I then had a long conversation with Sabine about xenopsychology, particularly the Upau-Rukvau, who were her area of study. I suspect this was how Orson persuaded her to participate in this admittedly rather odd encounter. Not being my specialty, I could only tell her so much, but I got the sense that it was still a lot more than humans knew about them. We then walked around the park, observing the various dog breeds. There were a startling variety of them, understandable perhaps given how long they'd been domesticated, but what was really surprising was that they were all the same subspecies. Despite the wide range of physiological differences, they could all interbreed with each other with very little problem. Add that to the list of reasons to research dogs. I didn't know of another species, natural or artificially bred, that exhibited that level of divergence without losing the ability to interbreed. I could, of course, have explored the many different dog breeds simply by watching videos, but there's nothing like seeing a subject firsthand. We went back to the park several times during my stay on the planet. However, the majority of my in-person research was conducted at Yosemite Ranch with Ragnar and his siblings. Orson and I went out there every couple of days, and either Burton Carradine himself or one of his sons would show us what the dogs could do and how to interact with them. Bethany, too, who loved dogs more than any other animal on the ranch, taught me as much about the species as a xenobiologist would have been able to. Apart from all the useful details of dog handling I learned from them, the thing that really struck me was how close their relationship with the animals was. The dogs weren't just tools to them, they really seemed to care about them. It was fascinating to me that such an aggressive, predatory species as humans could care about a non-human, much less an animal. I could see the logic in keeping their pets alive so long as they were useful, but dogs are, at the end of the day, just another form of meat, and I'd seen enough steaks eaten during my time on the planet to know that humans' appetite for that is in no way exaggerated. It was about 3 weeks after my first encounter with Ragnar that I got my best lesson in why humans love dogs so much. Orson and I were with Burton Carradine's youngest son, Hank, putting Ragnar and his brother Sven through their paces. We'd been there for hours, and it was getting near sunset, and we were just thinking about heading back to the city when we heard shouting. We didn't think much of it at first. There was always a lot going on the ranch. But the shouting kept getting louder, and it seemed to be moving in our direction. "You were supposed to be watching her!" "I was doing my job. You were the one who said she's not a little kid. You were the one who said she could do the work without needing babysitting." "I also told you to keep an eye on her, make sure she stayed safe." Bethany's father, James, and another of the Carradine sons called Luke came round the corner, still yelling at each other. Hank went over to his brothers. "Hey, what's going on? We got company, you know," he said, casting a pointed look back at me. "Where's Dad?" snapped James. "I don't know." Hank shrugged. "Seriously, what the hell's—" "I'm right here," Carradine Sr. bellowed from across the yard. "And I'd also like to know what all the ruckus is about." "Bethany's missing, Dad," James said. I still wasn't great at picking up human body language, but I could see the anguish in his eyes. Quickly, James explained what had happened. A group of ranch workers, led by Luke, had been going out on quad bikes to round up cattle grazing on the plains west of the ranch. Bethany had asked to go with them. The Carradine grandchildren were being raised to know how to take care of the ranch, same as their fathers had been, and her dad had allowed it, because she'd be with her uncle and a couple of other men. Apparently, that hadn't been enough. They were sure Bethany had been with them all through the morning, but at some point during the afternoon, they'd lost her. Each one of them thought she was with the others on the far side of the herd, and it was only when they got back to the ranch that they realized no one had seen her. They couldn't raise her on the radio either. She wasn't just lost. Something bad had happened to her. They'd covered a huge area over the course of the day, chasing down stray cows, so the potential search area was over 200 square kilometers. "Get the drones out," shouted James. "All of them! It's a lot of ground to cover even with drones," Burton Carradine mused, "and only a few of them have thermal imaging. Hank, get the dogs ready and get their night collars. We'll take them out in the truck, then let them out when they pick up the trail." Orson whispered to me, "Well, it looks like it's time for us to be getting back to the city. We need to get out of their way until they've dealt with this situation." He turned to Carradine. "I'll be taking our visitor back now. You let us know the moment you have any news, okay?" "Actually," I stopped him, "I think I should join in the search." I approached Carradine. "I can fly better than your drones, and I doubt your drones can administer first aid either." "Whoa, hold on." Orson stepped in front of me. "We all appreciate the gesture, but you're an alien, and you don't know this planet. I'm supposed to be keeping you safe. I can't just let you fly out alone into the wilderness at night." "My safety is my own responsibility," I informed him. "The Science Consortium will not hold you responsible if I have overestimated my abilities." "But I thought Amia couldn't fly at night." "Well, we're not natural night flyers, but we all have to take classes, and I passed mine with distinction. More than a decade ago, I added in the privacy of my own head, and I could count on one hand the times I'd tried it since. But they say once you've learned, it's a skill you don't forget. Besides, it's not like there's any trees out there I could fly into. But still, the exchange program has never had a fatality." Orson looked pained, and I could appreciate his dilemma and what it would mean for relations between Amia and humans if it turned out I was about to do something really stupid. He finally came to a conclusion. "Oh, hell, for Bethany's sake." "Can you see in the dark?" asked Carradine. "No, but I can follow them." I pointed at the dogs, who were being fitted with collars that had bright lights on them, color-coded for the dog. "Well, all right then," Carradine nodded. "Someone get this guy a first aid kit." The search party was underway less than 5 minutes later. Only 10 drones had the range to cover that kind of area, and only 3 of those had thermal imaging. They went buzzing off ahead of us, with pre-programmed search patterns. It would take them a long time to go over the whole area, but hopefully we would get lucky. The truck, dogs lying in its open bed, was much slower, as were the quad bikes. The grasslands were flat, but there were enough fissures, hillocks, and small river channels that it wasn't safe to go full speed at night. I glided above. Amia are better suited for sudden bursts of speed and sharp turns than long-distance flying, but I could cover a few hundred kilometers before I had to stop, and although I wasn't nearly as fast as a drone, I was still a lot faster than the ground party. There were 12 quad bikers, fanning out to cover as much ground as possible while still being able to see each other. But even between them and the drones, I didn't think they'd be able to cover all the search area before dawn. I let one of the day's last thermals take me up high, then started dropping to gain speed. The plains were now stained a deeper shade of red under the last rays of setting sun. The red dwarf's light was never very warm, and as darkness fell, the temperature would start to drop rapidly. With nothing to do but glide, I had time to wonder what had happened to Bethany. Was she even still alive? If she was most likely injured. Wolf was a harsh planet. An injured child alone on the plains at night. We had to find her quickly, especially since I wasn't much better adapted to the cold than she was. I'd elected not to wear my thermal vest and leggings, as covering my feathers would impede my aerodynamics. I was hoping my natural insulation would be enough. Tropical or not, Amia still have a fairly high flight ceiling, and I could cope for a while in low temperatures and low atmosphere, but the colder it got, the more it would sap my energy. I kept my eyes out as I sped over the grasslands. We Amia have much better eyesight than humans, for obvious reasons, since humans rarely need to look at things 1,000 meters below them. But we don't have any better night vision than they do. As the last of the light faded, I was forced to head towards the lights of the ground vehicles, which were painfully slow. An hour or more must have passed, circling lazily overhead as the humans struggled along down below. There was still nothing from the drones. I was a little nervous flying in the darkness, but being able to orient myself by the lights on the ground helped, and I was still far from getting tired. But I could already feel the chill of night setting in. Then, as I drifted low over the truck, I heard the dogs suddenly start barking. I hoped that meant they'd caught her scent. The truck stopped, and I saw Carradine get out. I wasn't quite sure how he'd get the dogs to tell him which direction Bethany was in, but he waved a piece of cloth in front of them, and I realized it was a shirt I'd seen Bethany wearing. Then he opened the bed of the truck, and the dogs shot off into the night. I flapped furiously to gain altitude again. I'd seen dogs run at the park, but out here on the plains where there were no obstacles at all. Those things are fast, and they didn't seem to be slowed at all by the darkness. Looking below me, I could see the multicolored lights of their collars quickly pull away from the quad bikes, trying to follow them. Soon I was the only one keeping up with the dogs. I could still see the lights of the quad bikes and the truck behind us, but they were at least a kilometer away and falling even further behind. The dogs looked like they were having the time of their lives, bounding through the grasses, barking excitedly, as if to say, "You've seen us within the constraints of civilization. Now let us show you what we can really do." I could almost see the wolves on ancient Earth, chasing down cows or horses or humans, and these were the creatures humans had decided to bring into their homes. But I'd spent enough time with Ragnar and his siblings to know the difference between a dog and a wolf. They were as loyal to Bethany as she was to them. However, I was worried that they were just running for the sake of it rather than following a trail. Surely, nothing could run that fast and still keep track of a faint scent trail. Then they stopped and milled about on the same patch of ground for a minute or two, sniffing and barking. I was about to report back that they'd found something, although I couldn't see anything, when the lights took off again in a new direction. Again, I frantically tried to get some altitude so I could follow them. The last time I'd stuck to a regular exercise schedule had been before I started my doctorate, and I was really starting to feel it in my flight muscles. Well, back in school, my physical education teacher always warned me I'd regret not taking his class seriously. I doubt he was thinking I would one day end up on the other side of the galaxy searching for an alien child. But he had a point. You should always be prepared. Was I prepared to find Bethany dead? I'd spent quite a lot of time with her over the past few weeks, maybe more than any human apart from Orson. Of course, as a scientist, I had a certain amount of professional detachment. I was here to study these people and their society after all. However, the hell with objectivity. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pushed on up into the sky, but I kept driving myself further to keep up with the dogs. If there was even the slightest chance of finding her alive, I wasn't going to let that girl down. I manged to get enough height to level out again and glide for a while. The dogs were still running along below, but even they were starting to slow down. However, they were stopping more frequently, circling a particular spot, sniffing about, then taking off again. I hoped this meant they were finding stronger and stronger traces of her. However, we were several hours past sunset now. I radioed back to see if the drones had found any sign of her, but no luck. Then the lights of the dogs' collars disappeared for a moment. One moment there, the next gone. I was perplexed for a moment. Then I passed over the last spot I'd seen them, and the lights reappeared. They'd found a gully, a narrow but relatively deep channel through the plains with a trickle of a stream at the bottom. Now they were following it, heading upstream and... Wait. They'd stopped. I heard the sound of excited barking and dived to take a closer look. They'd found her. I could see the quad bike. Either she just hadn't seen the gully or she'd tried to jump it and failed. The quad bike had flipped and landed on top of her. I could just see Bethany by the light of the dog's collars. Her lower half was beneath the bike, and from what I could tell, it looked like she was unconscious. I hoped she was just unconscious. Now I had to land. At night. Okay, I thought to myself, I've done this before. I can do this. Just come in nice and gentle and remember the ground is always closer than it looks. Easy does it, easy does it. Come on, don't crash, don't crash, don't crash, don't crash. Touchdown. I sighed with relief. Then I scrambled down into the gully and got the first aid kit ready to check Bethany was... 5 dogs suddenly stopped milling around Bethany, looked round at me, and growled. And I suddenly realized that, although I'd spent a fair amount of time around them over the last few weeks, I'd never ever been with them without a human there to control them. 5 sets of yellow eyes glared at me, with 5 sets of teeth bared. I froze. This close, I wasn't sure I could get into the air again before they reached me, and if they decided to attack, I'd be torn apart. But they'd never been aggressive to me so far, and I had to help Bethany. To my relief, I could just see her chest moving up and down, but she didn't look good. I took a step forward. They growled and tightened up their circle around Bethany. That was when I realized they were protecting their friend. This was what they'd been bred and trained to do for 1,000 generations: gather round the weak and protect them from the things that lurked in the darkness. And I was an alien, an outsider, everything they'd been trained to keep away. They'd been conditioned to live around humans, not a Mia. If I approached Bethany, they would see it as a threat and rip me to shreds. Except I wasn't a threat, I was there to help her, and she desperately needed help. I could see that she was breathing, but it was very shallow. I couldn't wait for the other humans to arrive and bring the dogs under control. She needed medical attention now, and I wasn't a stranger either. These dogs had got to know me over the last few weeks. That had to be enough, right? At least that was the rationale I used to push myself into doing what I did next. "Ragnar, sit!" I said it with all the confidence I could find and took a step forward. "Ragnar, Sven, Thor, Loki, Odin, come on, you know me, I'm here to help Bethany." I took another step and reached out my hand. "Sit! Come on, Ragnar, sit!" One of the dogs growled, a low warning note, and I very nearly jumped into the air, but I knew I couldn't show fear. "Ragnar, come on, boy, sit!" Ragnar sat. It was, and I say this without any exaggeration, the happiest moment of my life. I was shaking as I reached out to put my hand on his head, but he let me scratch him behind the ear. Good boy, good boy. You are the goodest boy ever, aren't you, Raggy?" Ragnar whined in agreement. One by one, the dogs started to relax. Thor tried growling again as I got near him, but when he saw he didn't have the support of the rest of the pack, he backed down. Quickly, I knelt down by Bethany. Pulse. Weak but continuous rhythm. Breathing, shallow but steady. I didn't know enough about human biology to make a more detailed assessment, but she was definitely still alive. However, it looked like she'd hit her head on a rock when she fell. I could see blood. First thing, get the quad bike off her. It was too heavy for me to lift, but by putting my back against it, I managed to tip it off her. There was a wound just above her knee, too, possibly a broken leg. I pulled a thermal blanket out of the first aid kit and tucked it around her, then found 2 exothermic pads and put them on her chest. Then I finally remembered to radio for help. Carradine was following the trackers in the dogs' collars, so he knew where they were and that they'd stopped. The search party was already converging on me. Over the radio, he talked me through attaching the biomonitors to her and how to apply dressings to the wounds. The dogs watched, whining and panting, but letting me work. Then, when I was done, they lay down beside Bethany, piled up against her and each other, sharing their body heat against the deadly chill of the night. I made sure to keep them off her broken leg, but apart from that, all I could do was wait. The minutes ticked by. I could hear the sound of engines in the distance, so I knew it wouldn't be long, but still, every minute counted. Then I glanced over and saw Bethany's eyes flickering. She was awake. I was so surprised I spread my wings. Then I saw her lips move, trying to say something faintly. I leaned in close to listen. Are you an angel?" I paused. "I don't know what that is, but no, I don't think so. I'm just a scientist." "You sure? I think someone would have mentioned it to me. So I'm not going to die?" No, you are absolutely not going to die. Your father's coming, and your grandfather, and uncles, and, well, everyone. Just hold on a few more minutes." "Oh, okay. And look, Raggy's here, and Sven, Loki, Thor, and Odin." "Oh." She smiled faintly, and with difficulty pulled an arm out from under the pile of dogs. Good boy, good boy." She was still petting the dogs when the rest of the search party arrived. As soon as I'd radioed in, they directed one of the heavy drones towards our position, the ones they use for lifting cattle that have been injured. No problem loading Bethany onto its stretcher, and it just had enough battery left after hours of searching to carry both her and her father back to the ranch house. There would be an air ambulance waiting there to take them to a hospital in Lupercal. I gratefully accepted a lift back in the truck, having had more than enough night flying to last me for the next decade. Unfortunately, one of the ranch hands had been trying too hard to keep up with the dogs and rolled his quad bike in the dark, luckily not injuring himself seriously, which would be a problem we could do without. But he'd taken the front seat next to Carradine, which meant I had to ride in the back with the dogs. At least it was warm. We didn't get back to the house until the first rays of dawn were breaking the horizon. I flopped down on the first sofa I found and didn't wake up again until it was almost night again. At which point, I found the Carradines already had a dinner laid out in my honor, with every type of fruit that could be brought in from Lupercal at short notice. Apparently, I was the hero of the hour, which was quite flattering. I was very clear that the dogs deserved most of the credit, though. They also told me that Bethany was doing well and that the doctors thought she was going to be fine. The first thing I did when Orson and I got back to Lupercal the next day was go visit her in the hospital. She was very pleased to see me, to the point where she grabbed me quite forcefully. A hug. I'm told it's an expression of affection. Seeing her sitting up in bed, smiling, well, I'd already been told that she was okay, so I wasn't too surprised. But it was definitely the second happiest moment of my life. She asked how she could repay me, as did her father and her grandfather and every other relative. And I said truthfully that I'd appreciate just continuing as we were with my research on dogs, particularly teaching me how to handle them. After all, it had certainly proved useful so far. The rest of my year in the Wolf 359 system, well, plenty happened, but fortunately nothing so dramatic. Bethany made a full recovery and continued to be a great help to me as I dived into my research dogs, farm animals, and the planet in general. Ragnar sired some puppies, which allowed me to study the growth and training of dogs firsthand. I wrote my paper, then rewrote it. Then about the 10th draft in, I finally thought I had something I could present at a conference. Then my time on Wolf came to an end, as all things do. I gathered up all my research and my samples, and I prepared to head home. Saying my goodbyes was hard, of course, even given that I had every intention of returning as soon as I was able to. I wasn't saying goodbye to everyone, though. To be honest, the hardest part of going home wasn't saying goodbye to Orson, or Sabine, or Burton, or even Bethany. It was getting the damn xenospecimen import licenses approved. You wouldn't believe the bureaucratic hoops you have to jump through to bring live samples from off-world back home. However, the look on my colleagues' faces when I walked out on stage trailing a pack of German shepherds, carefully trained from puppies to bark, howl, and snarl on my command. Well, that was definitely the third happiest moment of my life. Dogs may be a human's best friend, but I'm pretty fond of them, too.
If you're a fan of WRickWrites, the author of this story, he now has his own YouTube channel full of many more sci-fi stories. You'll find his channel link in the description. Please head on over and subscribe to his channel.